Our story is one of reimagining. Reimagining who you can be, what you can achieve, and how SEMA can support you. As technology and digital platforms disrupt businesses, we are reimagining what the profession can be. We've updated our syllabus to meet the expectation of employers, ensuring SEMA-qualified professionals have the skills to make an impact from day one. Reimagine your career. Contact SEMA Sri Lanka.
Welcome to LMDtv. This week on Talking Business, the 2021 budget is in focus and Anushan Selvarajah speaks with the economist Deshal de Mel.
Welcome to the show, Deshal. Good to have you with us once again.
It's a pleasure to be back, Anushan.
Just to get things started, what would you say are the two most significant challenges faced by our economy right now?
Yeah, so I would say that at the time the budget was presented, there are two major challenges faced by the economy. The first is the fact that we are seeing negative economic activity, negative economic growth in the wake of the pandemic. So we have seen agencies like the IMF predicting a real economic growth of minus 4.6% for Sri Lanka. The World Bank is predicting minus 6.7% for Sri Lanka. And these estimates were made actually before the current wave of COVID. So clearly there is a strong expectation that Sri Lanka will have a fairly sharp contraction in terms of economic activity, and we are not alone in this. This is what we are seeing in across several countries. So this is, of course, it has very wide ramifications on the economy overall in terms of unemployment, in terms of the sustainability of companies, cash flows, and everything. So that I would say is a really substantial challenge that not just Sri Lanka but a lot of countries in the world are facing. And the second important challenge that is more kind of a Sri Lanka specific challenge is with regard to our the large number of external debt maturities that we have in the coming years. So over the next 4 to 5 years, we have around $20 billion of US dollar debt that is maturing, that needs to be paid back by the sovereign. And in this current environment where we have a widening fiscal deficit, where we are seeing some sense of risk aversity amongst global markets also towards some of the frontier economies, how Sri Lanka sets itself up to be able to meet those external debt liabilities, that I would say is our second critical prevailing challenge.
So then what is your take on the key targets outlined in budget 2021? There's a 6% growth in the budget deficit and a 5% inflation. What's your take on that?
So in terms of the deficit, a lot of countries are expecting 2020 to see a higher fiscal deficit. And I think that is not surprising that Sri Lanka also has a higher deficit because in the context of a pandemic, it is important that governments do step in with some kind of fiscal surplus to really to make up for the contraction that you're seeing in private economic activity. So having a deficit is not something that is completely out of the ordinary in the current context. Targets like inflation, for instance, it's going to be interesting to see how those pan out, particularly given the way a lot of it is going to depend on how the government plans to finance that deficit. So, for instance, what we've seen in 2020 is that a lot of the wider budget deficit that we've seen in 2020 has been financed. It has been supported by the central bank coming in with some deficit financing as well. Now, typically, if that is carried out for a longer period of time, that tends to create inflationary pressures. So the 5% inflation expectation, I think a lot will depend on whether we see continued deficit financing by the central bank well into 2021 as well.
Now, Deshal, over the years, there have been many promises about simplifying our tax structure. But would we be right in saying that with budget 2021, little has been done to keep those promises?
So I would say it's a mixed bag. Now, if we go beyond what has been done in this budget, but if we take a step back to 12 months ago when we had the initial tax policy announcements by the new government, there were measures to simplify the taxes to some extent. So to a couple of examples, the nation building tax NBT was abolished. The debt repayment levy, the DRL applied on banks, that was also abolished. So there have been measures to reduce some of the applicable taxes. But at the same time, there have been all other measures that have that are less progressive, let's say, in terms of simplification. So I'll give you one example: the pay-as-you-earn tax, withholding tax on salaries, that was also abolished in I think in January this year. But that actually can create some kind of greater complexity, because now it means that the tax collection is not done by the employer, but by the employee. So the employee now has to file a new return. And of course, from an administrative perspective, it's complicated as well, because now the Indian Revenue Department, instead of dealing with a few thousand employers, has to deal with several million employees. So in that sense, that simplification is, I would say, less so. And again, with other withholding taxes, like the withholding tax on interest, previously the government would collect it directly from the banks and other financial institutions. Now the individual has to file separately by getting information from the banks, and then file a separate income tax claim. So there are elements that have been simplified and elements that are now a little bit more complex from the administrative perspective.
Would you have expected that to be allocations for the purchase of vaccines to combat this pandemic that we are in right now, over and above what the WHO has promised?
Yeah, so in terms of combating the pandemic in general, I think warrants a substantial amount of expenditure from the government, or action from the government in general that requires expenditure. So to give a couple of examples, in Sri Lanka, for instance, I think there's a clear need to expand our vaccine testing capacity as much as possible. We will also need to have more robust quarantine facilities as well, and a number of other areas that warrant higher expenditure. Now, in the 2020 appropriation bill, there has been some expenditure that was allocated for combating for addressing the pandemic. But the nature of Sri Lanka's budgeting is such that by the end of the financial year, allocations will then get cancelled and new allocations need to be made for the fresh year. So whatever has been allocated in the 2020 Appropriation Act is only for up till December 31st, 2020. So for 21, you need to have fresh allocations. Now, that was something I would have expected to have seen more of in the 2021 budget, but there hasn't really been a reference that we have seen in the speech with regard to things like expansion of testing, expansion of quarantine facilities, and as you mentioned, in terms of some allocation for a vaccine, the logistics around that. We know that there are in some cases cold storage facilities that are required. So I would have clearly the specifics may not be known entirely right now. But I think there's a case to be made that there could have been a more broad allocation that could then be used to address the clear requirement for addressing COVID that will go into 2021 as well.
What is your assessment of our borrowing targets, almost 3 trillion, in fact, and the strategy?
Yeah, so I think it's natural when your budget deficit expands that you're going to have an expansion in your borrowing requirement as well. Really, I think the important aspect then is how this is going to be financed. So there is a shift that is being proposed in this budget. So previously, Sri Lanka typically had a balance between foreign financing of deficits and domestic financing of deficits. And that has been used to maintain interest rates where they have been. What is happening in this budget is that there's an expectation that you shift from foreign financing to a great emphasis on domestic financing. So what this means is that there's now going to be a much higher requirement for borrowing from the domestic treasury bill and bond auctions, which is normally fulfilled by banks and other financial institutions. So in 2020 also we saw this shift taking place. But given the fact that we had such weak economic activity, there was no parallel demand in the private sector for private sector expansions, private sector working capital, and so on. But coming into 2021, we'd expect greater the economic recovery to start kicking in, and private sector demand for credit as well. Now, when you have private sector credit demand in parallel to this greater requirement for government borrowing also, it starts to mean that there is going to be pressure for interest rates to start picking up. So that will have to be that's a challenge in terms of how the government manages that. In 2020, that was managed by the central bank coming in with some deficit financing as well. But as I mentioned earlier, when you have deficit financing over a prolonged period, that also creates inflationary pressure. So what we're likely to see is clearly some upward pressure on interest rates as the year 2021 goes along, and some inflationary pressure if we continue to see deficit financing by the central bank.
We're going for a short break now. Welcome back to the show as we continue our focus on Budget 2021 with economist Deshal de Mel. Deshal, just before the break, you assessed borrowing targets and strategy. But what are the implications of those on our debt repayment schedule?
So in terms of debt repayment, Sri Lanka's real challenge is on the external debt side. So Sri Lanka, as I said, has a large number of maturities in the next 5 years. So more specifically in 2021, Sri Lanka has to pay sovereign liabilities of around $4 billion US. And in 2022, we have another $4.5 billion US of sovereign liabilities to pay. And at present, so as of end of October 2020, our reserves were around $5.8 billion. So clearly, there is a need to find ways of shoring up these reserves in order to meet these liabilities that are coming up in the next 2 years. Now, what typically middle-income countries do is they would be going to borrow funds from global bond markets in order to have a regular inflow into reserves to be able to refinance liabilities that are maturing. Now, the concern that Sri Lanka has is that with our budget deficits expanding, there has been concern by global rating agencies and by global investment banks about Sri Lanka's ability to tap into global markets to be able to refinance debt. Now, right now, the yields on Sri Lanka's external debt, for instance, has gone to double-digit levels. So we do not have access to global bond markets to refinance debt right now. And that, I think, is really one thing that markets were expecting from this budget. Markets were expecting a path to fiscal sustainability. That will then enable Sri Lanka to regain access to global bond markets. And it remains to be seen whether global markets will respond in a favorable way to this budget as well. So I think thus far we've had Moody's commenting, saying that the budget is not a credit positive. So that doesn't really bode very well for Sri Lanka. So I think steps have to be laid out in the coming weeks and coming months. That will then give reassurance to global markets that Sri Lanka does still have a credible path to fiscal sustainability that will enable us then to refinance our debt going forward.
Deshal, one aspect of Budget 2021 which earned a lot of brickbats, at least on social media, is the encouragement for tax and forex chiefs to invest their hidden funds here, paying only a 1% tax, whereas everybody else in the country has to continue paying out the full amount. What is your take on this?
So this is it's not a particularly new idea. This kind of thing comes up quite often whenever countries have pressure on their foreign exchange reserves. So as I said earlier, Sri Lanka has around $5.8 billion of forex reserves and significant upcoming reserves repayments coming up. So therefore, you have this kind of proposal coming in to try to scrape together whatever we can. And I think even in April earlier this year, we had a similar proposal to encourage Sri Lankans and other foreigners overseas to send in money into deposits with no questions asked, so to say, in order to try to bring in these reserves. So typically, it doesn't really have a large impact in terms of bringing material amounts of money concomitant to the forex gap that we need to settle. So I don't know if it will be very effective. Certainly, it'll have to take into account Sri Lanka's obligations internationally, also on things like anti-money laundering, on countering terrorist financing. All those aspects will have to be taken into account and cannot be ignored. So I'm not really optimistic in terms of this having any material impact in terms of really solving Sri Lanka's forex problems. And of course, it also raises equity issues for those who actually do comply with the legal process as well.
In your opinion, what are those areas that they could actually be looking at to increase our revenue right now?
So I think there's a lot of things that can be done without necessarily increasing rates as well. So for example, we discussed earlier about some of the withholding taxes. So I think that is one measure that has been quite effective in terms of tax administration, that is able to really broaden the tax base without necessarily increasing tax rates. So if you go back to that example about PAYE, in that the tax administration department, the revenue department, with a system like withholding tax like PAYE, you only have to deal with administration of a few thousand employers, whereas without a withholding tax, you have to deal with all of the more than 1 million employees. So it's much more easy to kind of focus and have revenue collection when you have withholding tax of that nature. Same applies, I would say, to withholding tax on interest income. So that is, I think, just one example of what can be done on the tax side. There are also a number of non-tax revenue measures that can be done that can be really addressed to improve our revenue. So, for example, if we take a resource like telecom spectrum, that is again something that if you have robust auctions, if you have ways in which you're really maximizing the value to the state from these really valuable resources like spectrum, that again is a significant source of non-tax revenue that you're seeing in a lot of countries that are middle-income countries and higher-income countries. And these are the kind of measures that we need to look at in terms of expanding our revenue base. And also, if you look at as a country grows in terms of its income levels as it becomes more advanced, a lot of revenue typically in more wealthy countries is based on wealth taxes and not so much on income taxes. Now, Sri Lanka has very limited wealth taxes. So I think in the 2017 Inland Revenue Act, there was introduction of capital gains tax, which was, I think, in a small way addressing wealth taxes. So wealth taxes become important as a country advances in terms of its income levels and its development levels. And Sri Lanka will have to look at such wealth taxes going forward, because right now a lot of our taxes are really concentrated on indirect taxes, and the burden of indirect taxes falls more on the poor. So in order to shift to a more equitable tax base, it's more important that we shift from indirect taxes to taxes based on income and taxes based on wealth.
Now, as a final question, Deshal, just to tie in everything together, what is your opinion of Budget 2021? Is it good or bad?
So if you go back to the two challenges I spoke about at the beginning, I would say this budget does a fairly good job in terms of addressing that first challenge, in terms of providing some kind of fiscal stimulus to address that the decline in economic activity from the private sector. So the government steps in terms of higher level of capex, in terms of providing incentives for private production as well. A lot of that is addressed quite effectively in this budget. I would say where the budget falls short is really in addressing that second challenge, that challenge of external debt management and external debt repayment. Because there, I think what markets were expecting was for the government to set a credible path for fiscal consolidation in the medium term. And I think that is really where the government has not really in this budget set out the measures in which revenue is going to be enhanced in the medium term in order to bridge this budget deficit from the 9% levels that we are seeing today to come down to a level of around 5% in about 5 years' time. So I think that is really where what is really missing in this budget. Whereas in terms of the stimulus side, it does address to some extent what was required.
Well, that was quite insightful. Thank you very much, Deshal, for joining us on the show. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you, Anushan. Always good to be back.
After a short break, Ashwini Vethakan will bring you a roundup of local news. Stay tuned.
We are the first credit information bureau in the South Asian region. We maintain credit information in order to facilitate credit to everyone. We at CRIB do not blacklist. Loan applications are easier if your credit information is with CRIB. CRIB reports do not provide recommendations. We do not give our opinion. The Credit Information Bureau of Sri Lanka. We help create a credit-worthy society.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Ashwini Vethakan, and here's a roundup of local news. As of earlier this week, the number of infected COVID-19 patients stood at 20,171, with the recovered numbers being 14,069, and the total deaths now stand at 87. On Sunday, according to the prison department, the total number of COVID-19 cases reported from the Sri Lankan prisons had risen to 652 after another 35 cases were detected. The vote on the second reading of the 2021 budget was passed in Parliament on Saturday with a majority of 99 votes. A total of 151 votes were cast in favour of the 2021 budget, while 52 votes were cast against. The committee stage debate on the budget began Monday and will be held until the 10th of December. As of this Monday, a total of 40 office service trains were scheduled to begin operations. However, Railways General Manager Dilantha Fernando said that the trains would not stop at stations located in isolated areas, while schools across the island, excluding those in the Western Province and the isolated areas, reopened from grades 3 to 13. Meanwhile, the $306 million Japanese-funded Phase 2 of the Bandaranaike International Airport expansion project finally commenced construction last week and is to be completed in the next 3 years. Construction of the new multi-level passenger terminal building will increase the passenger handling capacity of the BIA from 6 million to 15 million passengers a year. In other news, the World Bank has commended measures taken by Sri Lanka to ensure employee rights and well-being during the COVID-19 pandemic and recovery steps. The World Bank country manager for Sri Lanka, Chio Kanda, commended Sri Lanka at a discussion with Labour Minister Nimal Siripala de Silva recently. Kanda said she believes Sri Lanka has the strength to address the issues that could emerge in the future and sustain the country's economy. And on a more positive note, the race to develop a COVID-19 vaccine is currently intensifying, and the University of Oxford has gained much credit among the institutions that are engaged in developing a vaccine for COVID-19. Sri Lankan-born consultant physician Dr. Maheshi Ramasamy is one of the principal investigators in the Oxford Vaccine Group. Dr. Ramasamy, who was born in Sri Lanka, completed her medical education in the United Kingdom. Her name has been highlighted a number of times in an article published by the world-renowned medical journal The Lancet that reports on the clinical progress of the vaccine being developed to counter COVID-19. She is currently a consultant physician at the Oxford University Hospitals NHS Foundation Trust and also serves as the principal lecturer at Megan Medical College. That's all we have for this week. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you for watching and stay safe.